Ray, you can get us started. Oh, and you can't hear that's my concern, is that will you be able to hear what I play through screen sharing if I have headphones in? That's my worry. So, yeah, we'll try it out. And, oh, share computer sound, tight. Okay, tech savvy. I have to download something. Cool. Can you guys still hear me?
Yep.
Your speaker is not working. Fuck's sake. Okay, whatever. We'll try this, see how it works. And starting from, so last time, and I'm sorry for canceling class on Tuesday, things happen. Last time we started out talking about cocaine, or we left off talking about cocaine. We'd previously gone into amphetamines, and amphetamines, so that you guys remember a little bit, are, well, amphetamine itself is a salt that can be pressed into tablets in the form of Adderall, with a little more complexity than that. Like, there's a little bit more to it than just getting pressed into tablets to be Adderall, obviously. But it's also sold as paste or powder in the UK in particular, especially in the Netherlands. That's a very big thing in the Netherlands. Can we talk a little more about why they give you more muscles too? Yes. So stimulants in general, as well as steroids, like if you think about stimulants in terms of steroids, because steroids are stimulants, there's a reason that they're used for performance enhancement, right? So generally speaking, and I want to speak lightly on this because I don't want to get the exact science of how this happens wrong, but the gist of it, to my understanding, is that to a certain degree, being stimulated in general increases your blood flow and increases your circulation levels, which increases your body's ability to build and retain muscle. This is why so many stimulants are banned in sports, in particular amphetamine banned in baseball, specifically baseball, in the form of greenies. That's what they're called. We'll see a little bit about how other drugs have been used. Well, will we actually? I don't know if we go into that, but other stimulants are used popularly in sports as well, to the point where we do have to have specific guidelines about what drugs can and cannot be used because they're considered to be performance-enhancing drugs. So for instance, anabolic steroids, for some people, can make them feel more capable of performing in sports and other athletic activities. Now, Coke is a really controversial subject, I think, because the history of Coke, which we'll go more into in depth later, is just roiling with racism. Like, cocaine is possibly the most racially charged drug that circulates within the United States and beyond. I say loosely because all drugs are racially charged, but Coke in particular is very segregated in its use in a way that other drugs aren't quite as clearly, I would say. Standard dose of Coke is 30 to 60 milligrams. So a 30 milligram bump of Coke is a little mound like that, you know, sticking on the end of your key or whatever it is that you're using. A line is going to be closer to 60 milligrams. And that's what you would popularly see in movies. A pro tip for people that snort drugs: you don't have to do it like they do it in Pulp Fiction. If you're getting a nosebleed from the intensity of your drug snorting, you're probably doing it with too much intensity. You can very easily snort drugs by just kind of like lightly inhaling, although it won't work quite as well if you've already been doing a bunch of powdered drugs and you have like crusties in your sinuses, which happens. Like after a long night of snorting drugs, you're going to have a hard time breathing through your nose, unless you're doing Coke, actually, which has a tendency to kind of clear out the nasal passageways because it's a steroid in that sense. Well, steroid loose again. But you can kind of see how this might pose a problem, right? If someone at a party offers you a bump of white powder and you assume that it's Coke and it's actually ketamine, and then the features on their face are rearranging and you're in the 8th dimension and not sure which way is up and down, and you're talking to the lizard queen, like that happens sometimes if you're really high on ketamine. So always ask before you do a bump of someone's things, and more importantly, I would recommend against doing bumps of strangers' drugs, because even the most well-intentioned strangers usually don't actually know much about the drugs that they own and are doing. In some rare cases they might, but there are some hints that people use when they're talking about their own drugs that indicate that they might not actually know what they're talking about. So be careful in festival and concert environments. People tend to be super cocky about their own drug knowledge, and it's often not that good. Like if someone's really confident, they're like, oh yeah, man, like this is orange sunshine LSD. It was like made in a lab in Italy and like hand delivered by polar bears. You're probably gonna know that that's not actually the case. Coke goes by a lot of names. I would say that blow is probably the most popular aside from Coke itself. In some older circles, it's known as white or snow, and in some younger circles, regionally, is known as yay or yayo. If you're on Coke, there's not much terminology for it that I'm aware of except for being coked out. Or sometimes cracked out. And sometimes the word speeding is used kind of colloquially to refer to someone that's under the influence of stimulants. But I would say that it's less common with cocaine. Most often you're going to find Coke in powder form, right? But you can also find it in rock form. And depending on the kind of rock form you find it in, it could easily be crack cocaine. And again, does anyone remember the number one difference between Coke and crack?
Baking soda?
Yes, that's right, baking soda. And the reason it's called crack cocaine is because when you put it in the end of a pizzo or a pookie or whatever other cute nickname you call your pipe, it makes a snap crackle pop sound when you heat it from below. It literally like fizzles and pops because of the bonds breaking. And then there are coca leaves, and coca leaves are the actual coca plant, right? And the coca plant grows wild in South America and is a huge issue of pesticides and deforestation. We'll come back to that in a lecture about environmental impacts of the drug war. But coca leaves are commonly chewed, especially in native populations in South America. It's not uncommon to start your day by chewing some coca leaves. You know, it's a stimulant that is absorbed differently when you do it orally in that way, as opposed to snorting or smoking it, because the high is less intense of a come up and less of a rush. It's akin to drinking a cup of coffee in some regions, to just like chew a couple coca leaves and have that be a mild stimulant. It's a cultural thing. You most commonly will snort coke, right? Like that's obvious, I would say, from media depictions. It comes on pretty quickly, within 2 or 5 minutes, but it doesn't last very long. So if you have a bag of supposedly coke, which I'm just going to tell you right now is probably not actually coke, let's be real, you shouldn't be high on this bump for more than a max of 45 minutes, like max. And oftentimes you'll start feeling yourself come down off of this bump within 20 or 30 minutes. So if you find that you've done a bump of something that you think is coke and you're stimulated for like 2 or 3 hours thereafter, congratulations, it's probably amphetamine. Probably, I would say, but it's not definitive. Smoking it, again, smoking anything allows the substance to cross the blood-brain barrier a lot faster. So you're going to get higher quicker and more intensely. So part of the reason that crack cocaine is so much more powerful than cocaine is not because they're different drugs. It's because you're smoking coke. That's basically what you're doing, is you're smoking coke in concentrated form. I would say that this is comparable, and if anyone dissents to this, let me know, but I would say that this is comparable to smoking flower in a joint versus doing a dab. It's a different form of the same substance. It's just ingested with different purposes, basically, because doing cocaine is like, it does when snorting coke, I think, is including the after effects, because you do feel like a little mild stimulation afterwards for a little bit, but the peak of the experience is not very long. Now, coke is primarily, and this is just a common thing we see with stimulants, right? Like stimulants are characterized by dopamine, norepinephrine, and often a little bit of serotonin. And cocaine is no difference here. Like it's primarily a dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine agonist. So coke acts as a releasing agent. It does release some of these neurotransmitters into the synapse, which is what's part of gives you such that rush and that sensation of like grandiose, not grandiose, this sensation of capability and socialization and like being, yeah, that exactly, shark, that. So that's part of what gives coke its effects. But we'll see a little bit later in this lecture that the reason that these three major stimulants that we're talking about, which are amphetamine, coke, and methamphetamine, all have different effects profiles despite acting largely in the same way on neurotransmitters, is that the strength of their action is quite a bit stronger. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, sorry. So here's coke in action, right? Cocaine is similar. It's sneaky, sneaky swiper. Oh, I thought I had swiper on here, but I don't. But it acts as a reuptake inhibitor as well as a releasing agent, right? So this is a double whammy. You have cocaine sticking itself in the dopamine transporter and then also popping these bubbles to release these neurotransmitters and having dopamine flood the synapse and bind at it. And it does the same thing. And this acronym SNDRI is actually a class of antidepressants as well. I forget, it starts with an E. Maybe it's Effexor, actually. I'm not positive which one it is. There's a really commonly prescribed SNDRI antidepressant, and there's actually some research showing that SNDRIs are more effective for treating depression than SSRIs. I think partly because they act on multiple neurotransmitters with more complexity. And having, like, think about it, that sensation of reward that's induced by dopamine and that sensation of energy that's induced by norepinephrine, it makes sense, right? Like, you would increase the pleasure associated with activities, the reward given from doing those activities, and the energy to do those activities in the first place. So something to think about is that this is kind of a consequence of this class of drugs. Yes, Effexor, thank you. Yes. So we start out in South America looking at cocaine. Specifically looking at the coca leaf, and we see that colonialization happens, right? We've got, oh man, I really need to know which country, oh my God, who invaded, I don't want 1 second, let me look at my notes. I didn't look at these that closely. Oh yeah, it's the Spaniards. I knew it was the Spaniards. Right, Spaniards invaded. They come in, they're like, okay, this is some devil shit, like cocaine, coca leaves, whatever it is that you guys are doing, it's some devil shit. It's making you guys energized, and like people have sex sometimes and sometimes party and like, oh God, drugs, like scary. But then they started doing it themselves and they were like, oh shit, this is actually, did you guys know you could get high off of this? Like, did you know that? This is actually kind of cool. It's like, we could totally capitalize on this. So they did, because that's what the Spaniards do. And this just like really catapulted into making Peruvian coca wine in the 1800s. And this was actually exported as a product where you could, it's like Coca-Cola, except it was in wine. You could drink wine and have your cocaine at the same time, effectively. Not quite cocaine though, it's a little different because it's the coca leaf itself, which is the basis for cocaine. But does anyone remember what the combination of alcohol and cocaine does in your liver? Does anyone remember that? I'd be impressed.
Coca ethanol?
You're so close, coca-ethylene, but yes, I'm very impressed that you remember that. Virtual high five. Right, so it turns into something different, right? And then we have Coca-Cola, because obviously that's the next step. Like, for those of you that were not aware of this, Coca-Cola contained coca, like it was a stimulant, actually. It was psychoactive. And then there was Sigmund Freud, who really took this and was like, well, this is kind of dope, and I'm going to tell all my doctor friends about it. And then some of his doctor friends ended up dying from coke use, actually, because it just became so popularized that people were using it all the time in medicine. It was just getting used as an anesthetic. It was also used as a wakefulness agent and an effectiveness agent. And it wasn't until like decades after this that people started actually dying from excessive cocaine use. And people were like, or not necessarily decades, but it was decades. The insane schedule medical residents have is also due to cocaine use by the inventor. Whoa, that is really interesting. I did not know that. That's fascinating. So Sigmund Freud developed a pretty serious cocaine problem, and possibly daddy issues. Now we're gonna have to see if you guys can hear my audio right now. Can you hear
Hi,
it?
this is Emily from the Vice office in Brooklyn.
Yes?
Our colleagues at Vice Columbia took a
Excellent.
dangerous journey along El Naya to examine the
Okay.
cocaine production
Vice
process
documentaries
step by
just make my
step.
heart sing, honestly.
Mucho para vivir, para comprar nuestras cosas. En cambio, un raspachín pues se gana 120 mil pesos, dependiendo cómo esté el tajo.
Estamos en un laboratorio de pasta de coca
donde nos van a mostrar todo el proceso desde que llega la hoja hasta que se convierte en el líquido que es la base para la pasta, y también para saber por qué ellos eligen este camino y no otro. ¿Cuántas arrobas de hoja de coca hay aquí?
Se trabajan con 20 arrobas, porque como siempre se trabajan 3 tarros. Es una coche de 250 kilos, para que quepan los tarros.
¿Cuántas veces la pisan y cuántas veces la pican?
3 veces. Aquí pues ya van el segundo proceso de la picada, que es donde se le arroja el material. Aquí el material es cal, nutrimón, se le echa sal para que ella haga el proceso un proceso de fermentación donde la hoja llega y pela y saca el alcaloide de la hoja. Luego se le hace, después de eso se la patea para revolver la hoja, para que la hoja quede uniforme con todo el material y para que la hoja vaya quedando más pequeña, porque ya pasa luego el proceso de los tarros. Esto se llena, se coloca en esa orilla y se llena de combustible, o sea, es decir, gasolina, petróleo. Se arroja lo que es la hoja a la gasolina y saca todo el alcaloide que queda en la gasolina y llega hasta la tina de allá, donde escurren esos 3 tambores. Acá el compañero llega y arroja la gasolina en ese tarro para luego echarle otro químico, donde llega y se separa la gasolina de la droga. Y la droga sale en agua y ahí ya pasa el proceso pues, de corte, donde le echan otros químicos y ya vuelve pasta de coca.
¿Y cuánto te pagan por el
día? El día es a 40.000 pesos, pero por un día, una jornada larga. O sea, no es como la gente piensa que es una cantidad altísima, no. Acá lo que hace es trabajarla nomás.
¿Ustedes creen que puede ser rentable cultivar otra cosa?
Pues ahí tocaría como sentarse con la comunidad y discutir las cosas, porque digamos que eso no es como una decisión pues individual, ¿no? Sino algo colectivo. Pues, digamos que y la raspan allá, pero no hay quien la trabaje acá, entonces no hay trabajo ni para el uno ni para el otro.
So, as I've said before, this is something that we're going to see. Do they always use gasoline to refine it? That's a really good question. I don't think so. I think that it needs to be something that can break down the leaves into the alkaloid that's contained within them. But it does not have to be gasoline for sure. It can be multiple other things that I would imagine is simply the cheapest option available. Now, I know that I sound like a broken record here, but I do want to reiterate the fact that they're making $14 a day, right, for long shifts. So presumably like 10-hour shifts. $14 a day to be doing this incredibly labor-intensive and highly dangerous and illegal work. So we need to be asking the question right now of why someone would do this in the first place, right? Because I think that a huge misconception around the drug trade, particularly the cocaine trade, is that it's just saturated in money. The people that are doing it to make money. And the reality is that the people who participate, usually in low-level supply chain, are doing this to escape poverty in extremely remote regions where there isn't a lot of other work available, if any. And this particular region happens to be favorable to growing coca leaves, and there's demand and there's supply. And this is the product of a failed system. This is the product of a system that has not given its people an alternative. And I want to make that very clear, because this is not an appealing job, right? Like, you look at this and you see 10 hours of hard labor for $14 per day. That's not what you would typically imagine from part of the cocaine trade, but this is very typical in manufacturing systems, very typical. Oh no. Okay, well, this is about how crack was made, but instead we'll take a look at Paco. And this is one of the more international things that we're going to take a look at, because different countries with different socioeconomic situations, different governance situations, different access to different drugs, basically improvise, adapt, overcome, right? Like, different drugs are available in smaller quantities in various countries. So people have methods of bulking them up and making them more accessible. How many of you are familiar with Crocodile? Thumb up if you've heard of Crocodile before.
I have.
Okay.
Scary stuff.
Yeah, well, I don't see many thumbs, which is interesting. I was surprised, I'm actually surprised. We'll get back to Crocodile a little bit later, but to give you a rundown of Crocodile, Crocodile is desomorphine, which was created as an alternative to morphine and heroin. It's more potent than morphine. It's more intense and faster acting than heroin with more, thumb up, but I don't know how to. Okay, well, this is your virtual thumb. It has more side effects, generally speaking. And desomorphine is circulating in Russia. Well, it was a couple of years ago. It's not quite as prevalent now as it was, but it made international headlines for being the flesh-eating zombie drug. Now, anytime you see a headline about drugs that includes the phrase flesh-eating, I guarantee that the people writing that article are going to include some major bias in it, because the product of, or that the result of a drug being flesh-eating means tissue necrosis. It means that something in this substance, maybe not the desired substance itself though, is causing tissue breakdown and tissue damage that can indeed leave like scaly patches of skin that just like fall off or rot or become gangrenous. That's a thing that can happen. But what you don't see is that it's not desomorphine itself that causes this effect. It's the fact that in Russia, it's so difficult to acquire clean injection supplies and good quality opioids, and there's a lot of opioid use in Russia and very little harm reduction, that people use battery acid and similar household chemicals to cook down their desomorphine into something injectable. That's where the flesh-eating part comes from. It's not the desomorphine itself. It's the fact that people are so desperate to not get dope sick, basically, and to be able to continue functioning, that they will create Crocodile in their bedrooms. And the injection site is what's really at risk, especially if you miss a vein with Crocodile. You do run the risk of damaging your tissues and your organs, and many people have lost full limbs because of this. So this is just another example of this. This is Paco in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And Paco is a similar method of kind of getting around the limitations that we have on accessing high quality drugs. I can't make this clear enough. Taking away the supply of high quality drugs does nothing to reduce the demand. Which means that if we want to look at a society that does not have harmful drug use, if that's something that we want, if we're looking at this from a goal-oriented perspective of how can we reduce the risks affiliated with drugs, and our solution is to be like, well, we need to get rid of all the drugs, I am telling you flat out, this is like fact, it's not going to work. It has not worked, and it will continue to not work because the demand is still there and people will circumvent the system to create what they need to. The quality will go down, the casualties will go up. So, always. So here's Paco.
City. After visiting Via 31, we managed to make contact with a Paco cook in another via, who agreed to show us how the drug is made as long as we concealed his location and his identity.
O sea, el Paco viene de lo que es la resaca de la cocaína. Y acá hay un par de kilitos acá. Va mezclado con unos componentes, que puede ser veneno para rata, hasta bicarbonato, todo eso. Tira un poco de coca. Un poquito de coca. Bicarbonato. Un par de gotitas de agua. Ahí se está cocinando. Esto se deja secar, que se seque un poco. Bueno, y después los pibes lo fuman en esto, que es una pipa. En esto lo fuman. Virulana adentro. Una esponja de metal. Sí, como esta, pero color amarillo.
Paqueros sometimes put metal cleaning fibers or ash to keep a flame going in their pipes. Now, cooking Paco does not require complex laboratories. Doses can be prepared in a basic kitchen just like this one.
No, esto se puede hacer todo acá en una olla, tirar los componentes un poco también, ya para preparar estas dosis, que son de 50. Ya para armar y para vender.
y los vecinos no se dan cuenta, entonces, porque no produce un olor el cocinar Paco o otro efecto.
Estamos en una villa acá. Estamos en una villa. Acá no vale todo. Por ahí
So these are poor areas in Argentina. Notice the theme here, right? Now, in terms of the purity of cocaine, this was a couple of years ago, but things haven't changed all that much. In fact, I would wager that the average purity of coke is even lower than it was at this point in time, because of decreased access to actual cocaine. The purity of street coke is approximately between 35 and 50%, but a lot of street coke in the US is around 5% pure. 5. Dead serious. Now, this is why a lot of people get really cocky about buying coke in particular, because they think they can gum it and be like, okay, it numbed my gums, or like they do a bump and they're like, oh yeah, that's good. How the fuck do you know? But you've never had good coke just because it's not available, you know? Like you have to do a litmus test of these kinds of things, and even if you do, you're not a high advanced technology, like you cannot detect it. But keep this in mind, that coke is 35 to 50% purity on average. That's very low. Just a couple of terms really quick. Our postnasal drip, and we'll see this in anything that's snorted or insufflated, which is basically that your mucous membranes and your sinuses get really inflamed because you're, you know, flying powder against them, and oftentimes that powder contains caustic chemicals and things that aren't supposed to come into contact with your mucous membranes. And this can include, in some cases, things like rat poison. Like, that is an actual thing that is used to cut drugs. That's not fake. Like, yes, it can happen. Some drugs are extremely painful to snort. Some drugs are not. 2CB in particular, if anyone in here is familiar with this one, 2CB is notoriously painful to snort. We're talking like jackhammer to the face kind of painful. But there are some drugs that are just like, you shouldn't eat them, so people snort them instead. However, something that's important to keep in mind is that a substance like ketamine, for instance, let's say you snort K, right? That's the most common method of ingestion by far. You're going to get postnasal drip, which is a disgusting flavor that slowly, within, like, I'd say the first 5 minutes or so, maybe you can escape to like 8 minutes if you're lucky, will just creep into your sinuses and slowly go down your throat until when you swallow, you just suddenly get this like, like this taste in your mouth. Now, some drugs are grosser than others to snort. Like ketamine tastes pretty goddamn bad. MDMA tastes pretty goddamn bad. Coke, on the other hand, is often not as bad. But when you're swallowing all these drugs, they are going into your digestive tract, your GI tract. And you have to think about this and think about the potential damage that can be caused to your GI tract, because there are some drugs like ketamine, for instance, where if you swallow them, they have the propensity. Hey, y'all. They have the propensity to get into your liver and into your kidneys. And because they have crystallized structures, this can cause damage to those organs. So a lot of people swear by the concept that if you're snorting ketamine, you should try and loogie your spit when you feel the postnasal drip going into the back of your throat. And that's actually not a terrible idea until we know more about how ketamine is processed by your liver and your kidneys, because ketamine can cause damage that way. But just think about that. And before you snort something, it's a fun and possibly very important exercise to look up how that something interacts with your stomach, in particular, your liver, your kidneys, because often people forget that when you're snorting something, it still goes into your stomach. And then there's this concept of fiending, which applies to far greater reach than just cocaine, but is particularly prominent as a term with cocaine, which is being preoccupied with the substance, being like thinking about it even while you're on it and it hasn't worn off yet. You're like, I just want more of this. And coke is notorious for being a very fiendy drug. You could do 1 or 2 bumps of it, and even after like 2 minutes after coming up, you're just thinking about the next bump. And for some people, this is a lot stronger than others, but it is a fairly consistent effect. Now, coke has a really poor safety profile, I'm going to be honest with you, and it's taken very lightly in a lot of circles, which is ironic, because if you ask the same people who do coke recreationally whether they would do crack recreationally, they would say fuck no a lot of the time, without realizing that it's effectively the same exact thing, a different method of administration. So until we have a better collective understanding of how both of these drugs work, we're going to continue to stigmatize crack in that way and have very loose guidelines around cocaine. It's true. So coke has the potential to cause extremely intense stimulation, especially for people that have existing cardiovascular problems, high blood pressure, high heart rate, etc. And this can cause heart attack and other problems like strokes even. Complication deaths from coke do include things like your appetite is severely depressed or suppressed when you're under the influence of stimulants, right? So there have been people that have done a lot of coke consistently and have died from just malnutrition, and also sleep deprivation. This usually will lead to stimulant psychosis before anything else happens. Do you think it's better that it's less pure stateside since it's so dangerous? I personally say that I would rather see someone accidentally do several bumps of amphetamine than of coke, personally. But I also think that it is possible to use cocaine recreationally responsibly, depending on who you are. That's the case with most, if not all, drugs, honestly, with some exceptions, because some are just a lot harder to have a casual recreational relationship with others. But yes, the cutting agents themselves can also be very dangerous. Exactly. That's a really big problem. And I would say that it's not a good thing that we have such incredibly impure cocaine, because the concept of people just snorting white powders and being convinced that it's coke, I think, is a lot worse than people knowing what it is that they're snorting, even if it has a higher risk profile than other drugs, right? If you know that you're doing coke, you can take adequate steps to prevent consequences from doing coke. You just can know more about what you're doing, and that's the most important part. You can't really become physically dependent on it, though. You can to some minor degree, but it's not actually the main, you have to be doing a lot of coke very consistently to develop a physical tolerance and dependence on it in this way. However, there is a very high possibility of developing psychological dependence on coke. And this is especially seen in party settings of people that come to kind of rely on it as a social lubricant, as well as an addiction potential. Coke is a highly addictive substance. It does have this pattern of changing reward pathways in the brain, especially in people that are susceptible to it. And this is, I think, possibly the first drug that we'll look at that does indeed cause harm to the brain and body if used excessively. With any drug, used excessively it's kind of gray area, but cocaine does indeed cause cardiovascular problems over time. If you're using it very recreationally or very regularly, it will cause cardiovascular problems. It will cause heart problems, as well as the high risk of addiction. This is, I think, the first drug that we're looking at that has a high risk of addiction, higher than people think, honestly. And especially if you're doing it frequently, again, anything that you're snorting often will probably damage your nasal passageways. And if you're snorting things very regularly, then you might end up with a deviated septum, which means basically that a hole is eroded right here in your upper guy, and it just goes right through. And that has totally happened on many occasions of people that just snort things too frequently, but mainly when they're cut. There's also a really large number of overdose deaths involving coke. And the word involving is important here, I would say, because a lot of these deaths involving a drug means that there were other drugs involved. However, when we're looking at the deaths involving opioids, there's a comparison to be made here. There are a lot of deaths from cocaine, but even more so from benzos. Benzos have almost as many deaths involving them as opioids do per year, but we're not talking about it because they're usually prescription drugs that are not treated very seriously. Now, crack, very similar situation. It's the same all across the board, I would say, in terms of the risk profile. I would say a higher risk for both dependence and addictions simply because of the intensity of the route of administration. That's the only reason. So technically, I shouldn't even be separating these two things because they're the same damn drug. The one thing that is kind of unique to crack, though, is the possibility of liver damage from cutting agents, and also crack lung and crack lip, which is damage to your mouth and your lips, basically, from having this very hot pipe very close to your face, because it wears off quickly, so you have to be continuously reheating it, right? Now, a lot of the time in coke, we'll see strychnine as an adulterant, which is a literal pesticide. And I would say this is far less common than levamisole, which is a cattle dewormer. So pick your poison, literally. But levamisole is not quite as bad for you as strychnine, right? Strychnine is a pesticide, you are poisoned, period. But levamisole was a retracted cancer treatment from the FDA, and it's an antiparasitic. So if you got worms, then you might not have worms anymore. So that's cool. But if you're using it frequently, you can very severely compromise your immune system. And there's a lot of conflicting data on this. Generally speaking, if you're doing levamisole by accident a couple of times, you're probably going to be fine. But if you have a regular supplier, for instance, and you do coke frequently, who cuts his bags with levamisole, then you might experience some really serious immune consequences. Then there's scopolamine, which is a really interesting one that we'll come back to in a little bit in a couple lectures. Scopolamine is an anti-nausea medication, but it's also found naturally occurring in plants in South America. And it's been marketed, or it's been popularized in the media as the ultimate date rape drug, because apparently someone can walk by you on the street with scopolamine in their hand and onto you, and you lose your sense of identity and become highly suggestible and dissociated and delusional. Is that true? It can be. However, possibly not to the extent that the media says. Scopolamine is not that common of a cocaine adulterant because it's such a deliriant. It makes you lose touch with reality. At least I'm worm-free. Hashtag thanks levamisole. I love these chats. How frequent is frequently? You know, that's a really hard question to answer, I have to say. Like, there's an interesting, yes, there's a Vice documentary on scopolamine. A really good one. We'll actually look at it later in this class. Great. I love that. The question of how frequently it is safe to do a particular drug is just so hard to say. And I know how maddening that is. But if there's anything that I've learned from being in drug education, it's that less is more. And generally speaking, if you set an initial use plan for yourself and you find yourself making consistent edits to it, that might be something to look at. In terms of the frequency of cocaine, my personal sentiment is that things that have the potential to become problematic, because it does have such a higher potential for like inducing addiction than other drugs, is, I would say, like once a month, personally speaking. And if you feel like you can do it more frequently than that, then go for it. But I would generally say a more conservative estimate is a good place to start and see how your body reacts to it. A good litmus test, I would say, is if you think about some event that you're going to go to, some social gathering that you're going to go to, some night you're going to have with a friend, and you're like, oh, I could do some of this drug that night. And then you think to yourself, maybe I shouldn't. And there's a flash of like, uh-oh, in your mind of any level. If you're like, or like, I really want to, or like, that's not going to work. Even a little bit, stop for 6 months. Just do it. Even if it doesn't feel completely necessary, that's my recommendation. Because if nothing else, you will set the precedent for yourself that indulging in those thoughts is not okay for you. That's not a hard and fast rule, but I think that it's a really good one to start off with, because especially with drugs like ketamine, for instance, that can be very sneaky and also are addictive substances, but people tend to start using them more and more often. And it's very easy to justify. It's similar with alcohol even, is if you think about going over to your friend's house, right? And you're like, oh, we should have a couple beers. And you think, wow, we have a couple of beers every time I'm over at my friend's house. And you think, maybe we shouldn't. And there's any kind of sensation of discomfort within you, that's a sign. So that's my recommendation. In terms of levamisole poisoning, which was the actual question, I just realized. Nice cat. I would say, like, again, I don't know exactly, but I would say, like, again, if you're doing it more than once a month, that might put you at risk, but I'm not sure. Then there's lidocaine, which is a numbing agent. This is often added for the purpose of making people fooled into thinking that their coke is good because it numbs their gums. This one, however, is supposed to be administered as a topical numbing agent, so it can really fuck up your GI tract if you're snorting it and swallowing it. So be careful with lidocaine. Now let's talk about meth. This is meth. Hi, meth. Meth is average dose of, that's cute. Average doses of approximately 10 to 30 milligrams. So this is a small quantity, right? Like 10 milligrams of a drug is like this much inside of a capsule. I don't even know if that's helpful when I do that. It's also known as speed or crank, tweak, yaba, shabu, ice, meth. Now, yaba is, I believe, in the Philippines. That's what it's popularly called. And shabu, East Asia somewhere. I'll have to look that up and remember. has different names in different regions, and East Asia in particular is a heavy meth using region. The slang and very derogatory term for being on meth is tweaking. And I have beef with this word because it is so easy to like walk around in any like urban area and see anyone that's acting even a little bit erratic and be like, that's a tweaker. Now, I just want to comment on how easy that makes it to completely disregard the entire rest of that person's story and personality and background and context. Words really do have power. And if people know, even if they are using meth, like even if they're on meth, if people know that the entire world around them has diminished their entire existence to the drug that they're using, and nothing else, not potential abuse or like housing insecurities or trauma or poverty, like none of that is taken into consideration, not their talents, their hobbies, their like positive qualities as a person, whether this person needs help. It is the easiest and simplest way of othering entire groups of people just by sight. So if you currently use the word tweaker or crackhead, which is a racial slur, or junkie, I really encourage you to start getting those out of your vocabulary and not being okay with it when your friends use those words as well. And this is one of those things where I feel like there might be some pushback here, people being like, SJW, like, don't be so sensitive. But you have to remember that this is scientifically backed. The words that you use to describe a person change their brain chemistry. It changes them as a person. It changes our entire social groupthink around how we conceptualize a group of people based on the activities they engage in. And this is what makes it easy to completely diminish the value of whole communities and not offer them help. What's the goal here? So I really encourage you guys to start thinking about that. Are any of the different names associated with meth mixed with something, or are they all just meth? That's a great question. Yaba, I think, is often meth and caffeine, or maybe it's shabu. Yaba and shabu, I think, are terms that involve other things, but we'll come back to that. The rest of them specifically refer to meth. Most often it will come in crystal form, and meth is shardy, as one might say. It looks like little shards oftentimes, but you can never ID a drug by looking at it. But it does have a rather distinctive log shape a lot of the time, like this. MDMA will not often look like this. And then it can sometimes come in pill form as well, because what do you know? You can get meth prescribed to you for obesity. Fun fact, that's why it's a Schedule II drug, less illegal than weed. Whatever. So oftentimes meth is found in crystal form, and then it's like crushed up a little bit and smoked or whatever, but it can also be found in pill form, and you can inject meth. So I would say a lot of the time when people are injecting a prescription drug, it's taking the pill, crushing it, cooking it, and then slamming it, which can be a problem because the binders in these pills, the things that hold them together, can sometimes be really bad for your veins. When you smoke meth, you come up really fucking fast, like within seconds or minutes. It lasts about 1 to 3 hours. When you inject it, you also come up really quickly, and the rush is very intense from injecting any drug. It is the most intense way to consume any drug. And it lasts for about 4 to 8 hours. And if you eat it, it takes longer to come up, and it lasts about 8 to 12 hours. So this is like a smoothing out of effects. We can kind of see how different mucous membranes in different regions of the body will react at different speeds. So if someone's like, man, I just like smoked X thing, then you know that they're going to come up faster and harder than they would if they ate it. And it comes with its own set of effects. Now, it actually first started getting popularized, or it was popularized in Japan actually in the 1900s, which partly explains why it's more prevalent in East Asia than other regions. It was very popular in World War II actually, and it was prescribed to soldiers, right? Because we've seen that soldiers get prescribed all kinds of stimulants. And then it became popularized within motorcycle gangs, particularly the Hells Angels. Now, the Hells Angels are very insistent that they're just a group of guys that like motorcycles, but you can be a group of guys that like motorcycles and also make meth, man. I don't know. So interesting fact is that, and we'll come back, I'll say this again later, but the interesting fact is that according to a friend of mine who was friends with some of the original Hells Angels, the word crank for meth comes from the fact that they would hide like packs of meth in the crank cases of their motorcycles when transporting them. Fun fact from the source. And then truckers actually became pretty prevalent in the realm of meth trafficking and also meth use, because like obviously you have to get across the country long distance. Now, what is this again? We're seeing middle class, working class America using stimulants to get through their day. And like I actually know personally people whose parents have been habitual meth users for the purpose of being able to work 3 shifts in a day, living under the poverty line. That just happens. And a correlation does not equal causation. One often leads to the other though, which is work leads to meth, not the other way around. Now, same thing as coke and as amphetamine, but what is the difference in potency between 100 milligrams of street meth crystals or 20 milligrams of Adderall? Do they process in your body in substantially different ways? So let's look at some math here. If the average dose of meth is approximately 10 to 30 milligrams, and the average dose of Adderall is approximately 10 to 20 milligrams, if we're looking at 100 milligrams of meth versus 20 milligrams of Adderall, that's going to be like 100 times the potency, because meth is about 10 times or more the potency of amphetamine, I think, or maybe it's even 100 times the potency of amphetamine. And we'll get to some more effects of methamphetamine that are not shared by amphetamine in a second, but we do need to look at the doses here. Let's say that we have 10 milligrams of meth and 10 milligrams of Adderall. The effects of 10 milligrams of meth are going to be substantially more intense than 10 milligrams of Adderall, and there's a higher dopamine release agent in meth than there is in amphetamine, which means that you're going to feel more of that rewarded feeling, and norepinephrine. It just is more of everything. It's more of everything. It's just like bigger and bigger and bigger than amphetamine. So it's hyper concentrated. There are some interesting studies out actually showing that some people, sorry, not some people, in a study by Carl Hart, I believe, a very famous and very well-renowned drug researcher, showing that people who were given the option of doing meth or amphetamine, not knowing which was which, thought that they were often pretty comparable at like scaled doses, and often chose amphetamine over meth. This does not mean that they're the same drug, and they do have very different properties, but I think it's a really important distinction to make that this is just a very concentrated stimulant, right? So in the brain, this is, again, meth doing its thing of going in and popping the bubbles. It is a releasing agent of these neurotransmitters. Again, it's an SNDRI, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And it also is a reuptake inhibitor, right? So it will double whammy. Now, I hope you guys remember me talking about amphetamine and how at high chronic doses of amphetamine, you can actually have rhabdomyolysis, which is rapid muscle breakdown, like tissue breakdown. And this is kind of a contradictory effect, because at low doses of amphetamine, you get an increase in muscle retention. At high doses of amphetamine, your muscles break down. So this is an interesting segue from the question that was just asked about the relative dosing of each amphetamine and methamphetamine. It really is an issue of scaling when it comes down to it. Like meth is just that much more intense. So we see these effects that we wouldn't necessarily in amphetamine at casual or recreational doses, because they're so more concentrated. Now, this muscle rigidity and tremors, can anyone give me an idea of why using methamphetamine chronically might induce muscle rigidity and tremors? What is responsible for that? Pop quiz.
Something to do with it being a dopamine agonist?
That's right, exactly. That's very good. So dopamine agonists tend to, or dopamine as a neurotransmitter is largely responsible for motor control in the body. There's another neurotransmitter called acetylcholine that is more specifically responsible for smaller subsets of motor control, but dopamine is a very major player in that realm. And dopamine dysfunction can cause Parkinson's, remember? Parkinson's, which can cause tremors, which is why in high chronic doses of methamphetamine, we do see people that develop tremors and motor control issues and tics and difficulty articulating, because the dopamine system has been disrupted. Let's see how it's no. I feel like this happened last time I tried to teach this lecture too, and I was like, I should look at them next time. Okay, well, we can't see how meth is made, but we'll take a look at how it's made a little bit more later. Now, a question that I'm asked pretty frequently is how difficult exactly is it to kick something like meth? Like really, how bad is it? Like how bad is it is the main question. Like how difficult is it to kick meth? So this is someone who's talking about his own experience with methamphetamine.
I was never on the earth, and today I am almost 7 years clean from this compound in particular. And I want to start this video off by saying this is not some bullshit dare scare tactic. This is not some government funded video. This is just one person who is addicted, who got sober, who can share with you directly what it's like to quit this substance and why it has been so difficult to this day. And you know, this is a difficult video to make, and you know, it's triggering for me to make it because I have to relive some of these memories of what it was like. In one of my previous videos, I talked about why the substance was so addictive, and in this video, I want to share what it is like once you quit and why it's so difficult to stay off the substance and why it is so dangerous, extremely dangerous. And so I quit August 16th of 2011. That is the day I quit. Currently, it's June 10th of 2018. And when I quit this substance, it was very difficult. I didn't accept that I was never going to do it again, and I had to take it one day at a time. But what really got me was the fatigue, the lack of energy, unwillingness to do anything, and just feeling depressed, and also a lot of weight gain and a lot of insecurities, aggression, irritability, you know, pretty much acute withdrawal. And I want to say at the start of this video, I should have said this, but I only used this substance for 8 months. Now, I dreamt about it every night for the first 5 years, every night. They'd be extremely vivid, or I would feel like they were real, and it would always be a dream of me trying to get the substance, or I would get a hold of the substance, and I would be holding, you know, my preferred method of as far as route of administration, which was a pipe, and I would be questioning why I would ever quit this substance to begin with in the dream. And then I would wake up, and I'd wake up in a state of shock because I had to realize that I can't do that anymore. And that's really what it was like. It was like grief. It was like grieving the loss of a loved one. I've lost people that I deeply care about, and I would compare this to that. There was a lot of shock, denial, like, you know, there's no way that the rest of my life, you know, there was a lot of bargaining, saying that maybe someday the stars will align and it will be in front of me and I can use it again. There was a lot of anger, you know, that I even touched the substance to begin with, anger at myself, a lot of depression, and the realization that I can't control the substance, this substance controls me, and I can never use it again without losing my life. And that's the reality to it.
Okay, now here's a question. How many of you would be outraged right now if I said that my stance was that all drugs, including methamphetamine, should be legalized?
I'd be okay with it.
Yeah. I'll come back more to why that's my stance later, but I'll give you a taste right now. The reason is what I've said before. When you make a substance illegal, what's the goal? If we're speaking about this in terms of goal-oriented activity only, right? And I'm actually going to leave on this thought today because we don't have a lot of time, and I think this is a very important point to get across now that we're at this first crossroads of the most controversial drug that we're going to look at probably. Like even heroin, I think, is less controversial than meth. Here's my reasoning. When you make a substance illegal, the goal, generally speaking, is to prevent people from using that substance, right? Like that's the goal of making it illegal. And from there, we can extrapolate that the goal is to prevent people from harming themselves or others on the basis of being under the influence of a certain drug. We agree? That's generally why, theoretically speaking, that's why drugs are technically supposed to be illegal. That's supposedly why they are. But if we look at the actuality of what happens, putting all biases aside, and I really encourage everyone here right now to, like, any existing like mental blocks you have against this concept, which I'm sure there are many for many of you, I really encourage you right now to do an exercise in blind faith and let them melt for a second. How many of you, by show of thumbs, have held an opinion about something social justice related that you felt really strongly about, and then years later, you were like, oh shit, I'm kind of an asshole for having felt that way or said that thing? Yeah. I would be surprised if it weren't most of the people here and in general. I really encourage you guys all to consider the possibility that this might end up being one of those things. And take this at face value from me, because our ability to hate the substance is really deeply, deeply ingrained and felt, and it is trained and it is educated in that way. We want to be looking at the solutions here. What's the problem, right? We see something like methamphetamine. What is the problem exactly from methamphetamine? Is it the fact that meth as a substance can be neurotoxic when you ingest it and can cause people to behave erratically and destroy their relationships? That is a problem indeed. But why are people using meth in the first place right now, right? Like, we really need to look at that, because that is the key to this. Why do people use a substance that is well known to cause their body harm? Why do they do it? What systems do we really need to be looking at here? If we had a society in place where we had systems that were built to support people's mental health, their emotional health, their physical health, their financial health, if we had systems in place that were intended to allow people to live fulfilled lives, would people still use meth? Really think about that. Like, really. Even if we had a perfectly legal supply chain of meth, where you could go into a dispensary and be like, I would like 20 milligrams of methamphetamine, please. And they had to be like, well, you came in here a month ago, so you can come back in a week or something like that. And then before they gave it to you, they would sit down with you and say, okay, well, here are the potential risks of this substance. Here are the potential benefits that you could reap from it if you do it in the right way, in some cases. Here's what you should look out for, and here's a number that you can call if anything goes wrong. Would we still see people using meth in ways that cause them harm? More so or less so than we see right now, when people buy it on the streets not even knowing what it is. That's my food for thought for you for the night. Informed consent, exactly. I really encourage all of you to think about this concept of legalizing meth, right? And again, loosen that judgment just a little bit if you can, and think about the possibility that there's real fruition here to be had. Think about the process, the real desires. Try and get that stigma a little bit less entrenched in how you think about meth. Okay. That's all for today, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Maybe I might not be able to do Tuesday, but have a wonderful night, you guys.